Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni viewer. The tech should be working properly, and I'm just here for another little Q&A session. No guests this time, no particular topics in mind. Just me sitting here, which I know could be disappointing, but I'll try to make it worth your while. And also, I'm going to try not to go as long as the last Q&A did. I completely lost track of time there. I'm going to try keeping it a little bit shorter, but we'll see what happens. As we're waiting for people to start showing up and make their presence known and start asking questions, I figured I might share a couple of books I've been reading recently that I found pretty interesting. First of all, because I've mentioned a bunch of times that I'm trying to develop an animated series, I actually have been doing my homework. I've been reading this Animation Unleashed book, which does a pretty good job. Looks like the pages are kind of glared by the light there, but it's pretty thorough when it comes to telling you stuff about how animation works, just how to frame it, how to design stuff and everything. I think this is going to be very helpful going forward. Also, recently got a book from one of my uncles about American horror in the 1950s called Rational Fears. It's an interesting title, don't you think? Because it's kind of hearkening to the idea of there's horror movies happening in the 50s, because we have the Creature from the Black Lagoon right here on the cover. But that wasn't the only thing scaring people in the 50s, was it? And it was also kind of hearkening to the idea of fusing the two, what the horror said about society and vice versa. So I've only just started this one, but I'm interested to see what it has to say. In the realm of fiction, one very unusual thing I've recently acquired is a book that currently goes under the title Japanese War Fantasy 1933, although the original title is Account of the Future U.S.-Japan War. This is a little bit of, I guess you could call it wartime propaganda that was written in Japan and sent to America in the 30s, specifically speaking about the idea of what would happen, not if Japan and America went to war, but when. This book predicts that it would happen in 1938, that there are all kinds of things. Like, it's annotated, it's got photos from photos and prints and stuff from throughout that time to give you some context. And obviously, since it's from Japan, it's going to end with Japan winning, but it's curious to see what people were thinking back then, before the war actually happened. It's an interesting little bit of history right here. Also have recently acquired, at the suggestion of somebody, of a fan, of course, the book Panic in Paris, which I'm told is sort of a kaiju-esque story, but written all the way back in 1910. And you can tell from the cover, if it looks like it's kind of copying the famous Destroy All Monsters poster, it probably is. And, on the author's live stream, you may recall that Cody Bratch was on there, and he had just published his first novel, Zernokia, or Zenosia. I'm sure he'll tell me how it is if he's watching. But it's his first novel. He sent me a copy for review purposes. I've just started that. It's another kaiju novel, so it's off to a good start. So anyway, that's what I've been reading. Well, actually, that's just a small fraction of what I've been reading, really. And I also recently, well, it's been a little bit, but I have finished Mel Brooks's memoir, All About Me. And if you want insights into the behind the scenes of some of the best comedic movies ever made, and even some non-comedies, if you believe it, because he did produce some, you will be fascinated by this. It reads like no other memoir you have ever heard, because it's written by Mel Brooks. He it's like he's talking to you. That's one way I would describe it. It's actually, I loaned it to my mother to read. She described it the same way. It's like he's in the room talking to you. So, just some recommendations. But what else have we got here? Any particular questions popping in just yet? I'm just scanning. Well, there are different people saying that they're just popping in to say hello. Like we have Chris Leotis here. I'm doing quite well. I hope everyone else is. Enzaru is here. Thanatos Zero X. Jesse. Alice. The Goji Shea 1991. Well, yeah, it looks like we've got a pretty good crowd here. And before that, waiting for the stream to start was the Almighty Oreo King, the Punk Otaku Scribe, Penguin Agents. All right. Is this a question? Let's see. From Javon Scruggs, or is it Javon? How do you defend the Monsterverse, especially the Wingard films, despite it being unpopular and the writing deeply creak? Well, I'm assuming that creak somehow means not good. But defending the Monsterverse for me is simple. I enjoy them. I mean, when I'm the first thing I look for when I'm sitting down to engage with a piece of entertainment is for it to be entertaining. I mean, it's right there in the name, right? If it's not entertaining, it's off the mark already. Now, as far as them not being very good, I mean, that is entirely a matter of subjective opinion. I happen to think they are good. They're not necessarily all on the same level of good, but I still get enjoyment out of them, and that counts as good in my book. So, and as far as like the Wingard movies not being especially deep, here's a question. Who said they need to be? Who said that any bit of entertainment needs to be deep? It can be deep, sure, but why does it always need to be? There's this thing called escapism that I keep talking about. It's there just to be entertainment for its own sake. If there's something you can get out of it, all the better, sure. But as far as it needing to be, it's unnecessary as long as you're getting enjoyment out of it. Yes, I will say that stuff like the Wingard movies are not necessarily the height of the Monsterverse. And I am kind of hoping that the reports of the next movie being a little bit more serious and more Godzilla focused and having better human characters are going to pan out. But, sometimes, I've said it in the past, other people have repeated it. Sometimes you just want to watch a cartoon, right? So we have the serious stuff, we have the fun stuff. As long as it's enjoyable, that's what gets me. Whether it is creek or not, whatever creek actually winds up meaning. So, but if you think that it's too deeply creek to enjoy, then, well, sorry. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Have I seen Sonic 3 yet? No, I have not. It's not because I'm not interested. I just haven't gotten around to it as yet. Although, from the sound of things, it doesn't need my help to succeed. It's doing gangbusters. Let's see. What's your favorite figure in your collection so far? That's kind of tricky to narrow down. I mean, I've got a lot of them, and I think they all hold a certain degree of value. Not just in the whole, I could resell these one day sort of thing, but more just like the personal value of, again, the enjoyment they bring by being here. So, I don't know. I mean, the first Godzilla figure I ever got, that's always going to hold a very special place in my heart. It was one of those Imperial ones, the 6-inch tall one. I didn't think to bring it here with me because I wasn't expecting that question. But, you know, I don't know if it's my favorite, but like I said, it's the first one. So that's always going to be in a slightly different category than all of the others. Let's see. What else? Let me just scan here. Is this just a normal Q&A or is there a specific topic? Yeah, just a normal Q&A. Just, general topics might include different pop culture things, writing advice that I'll do my best to answer, stuff like that. As long as you're not asking anything that's too personal or anything. I don't know why I said anything twice in that sentence, but I am just going off the cuff here. Let's see. From the Almighty Oreo King, would it be fair to say that the MonsterVerse has technically caused the Godzilla franchise to come full circle? We get a dark and gritty first movie that eventually blows up into Showa era fun. I don't know about full circle, but it is sort of continuing the cycle where it seems like every time Godzilla gets rebooted, there's the beginning being very serious, and then it gradually goes to a bit more bizarre and unusual. The Heisei series did technically get there, even though I know the general idea is that it's more grounded than the Showa series ever was, but it still got pretty out there with stuff like Space Godzilla and Destroya and stuff. Heck, it was weird from the very start with the implications of Godzilla being more than just a normal animal, and then Biollante was the very next movie, and Biollante is just weirdness incarnate as far as a monster goes. So, I don't know. It's just continuing the cycle, I think. I don't know if it's come full circle because full circle implies finality to a certain degree. And I don't think for a second that we are in the final stages. Now, what I'm really curious about is if Toho is going to do something similar. Well, actually, come to think of it, they kind of did, didn't they? Because, started very serious with Shin Godzilla, and then they did Godzilla Singular Point, which was just completely out there. And then they suddenly went back and did Godzilla -1. So they kind of, that sort of proves the point, right? They did the cycle. They started serious, went crazy, went back to serious, and in a very short space of time compared to other eras. I mean, that's one way of looking at it anyway. As a somewhat huge Doctor Who fan, as a somewhat huge Doctor Who fan, what do you think of said show? I've seen most of the New Who era that was, from that started in the early 2000s and is technically still running. I watched through the Matt Smith era, and I feel like in the Matt Smith era it started to drop off. I stuck around for Peter Capaldi, but by the end of Capaldi's stuff, the only reason to watch Capaldi, the Capaldi era, was Capaldi. He was still giving it his all, even though the scripts he was working with were not good. Like, even compared to the older stuff, I have seen my fair share of older Doctor Who, not in sequence, but I have seen it. Even by that standard, Capaldi's era was way, way off the rails. And then I tried Jodie Whittaker's first series. I watched the first few episodes. It lost me very quickly, and I just haven't looked back. Everything I've heard about the directions it's been going has told me, not for me anymore. Maybe not for anyone, because apparently the ratings are in the toilet all the way. But, since I haven't seen it, I won't say too much about it. Still, I mean, I like Doctor Who as it was, certainly. Where else are we? I don't want to... a bunch of stuff came flooding in. I don't want to miss anything. Let's see. How would you update Godzilla Evolve for the next MV movie? If you could change anything, that is. Well, obviously something is going to change. They said up front that this new design was always going to be temporary, and of course they're going to have to change it again because toy sales are part of what fuel the MonsterVerse. I suppose I would go back to something kind of like somewhere in between the uh, 2014 design and the 2019 design. Maybe sort of I think I would try to make the proportions make a little bit more sense. Godzilla's always had a small head, but even I think the MonsterVerse, at a certain point, the head got a little too small. I was actually surprised that Godzilla Evolved's head looked more proportionally like it belonged on the body, strangely enough. So give him back some heft, certainly. Make his head just a little bit bigger, keep the larger spines. But otherwise don't change it too much because a drastic change like Godzilla Evolved is okay every once in a while, but you don't want to stray too far, I don't think. Let's see. What are your 3 least favorite Godzilla films? The Polygon trilogy, easy. That covers it all, doesn't it? I still am amazed those movies ever got made. And yes, I'm more than happy to say that Hiroyuki Seshita was kind of screwed over by Toho and forced to make the movies that way because they wanted Shin Godzilla in animated form. And after seeing what he did with Gamera, even though it didn't get as much attention over here in the West, it was way better. So, it was just a bad set of movies that happened to people who otherwise know what they're doing. That being said, though, it doesn't change the fact that they are abysmal. So that was an easy question to answer. What's Snazzy up to tonight? He's taking care of some other stuff, organizing things, making sure we've got everything in order to go for February, because I got at least one more Patreon thing to fulfill for that month. I'll try to do a couple more. Yes, I do Patreon requests. You can check the description if you want to know more about that. But, he's taking care of stuff. I'm getting thirsty talking by myself. Let's see. In the GVK art book, there's a cave painting of what appears to be a Gojira specimen with wings attacking both its own kind and the Kong's. Any thoughts on what that might be? Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Did it make its way into the movies too, like the Godzilla vs. Kong opening credits montage? I don't recall because I haven't seen that movie in a little bit. I know the popular theory is that it's Space Godzilla. Or that, I mean, it's like everybody is looking for evidence of Space Godzilla in the MonsterVerse, and maybe a Space Godzilla could make sense if done right. I don't necessarily think that's specifically the plan, although no doubt if we do get a Space Godzilla and it just happens to have large protrusions that look like wings, people are going to say that was the case all along. But I don't know. It could be something completely different. It could be something. Honestly, who knows? It could have been meant to be like sort of a prediction, like how you had the cave paintings at the end of Kong Skull Island that showed Godzilla and Ghidorah fighting, which yes alluded to something in the past, but also alluded to something in the future. Maybe that was alluding to Mechagodzilla, and because it's a art book thing, it wasn't finalized yet. I really don't know. At this point, it's anybody's guess. Let's see. Excuse me. I'm doing well. I hope you're doing well also. Kaiju media has blown up in the last 10 years. Do you think that kaiju are going through a boom like superheroes did in the 2000s and 2010s? Well, they're certainly more popular than they have been in a while. I don't know if it's comparable to what superheroes have done, because superheroes have officially glutted the market for a while now. Like, Yeah, like that. It was a gradual process where it started off. You had one superhero movie in the summer. Maybe after that one did well, there were two the next year from two different studios. And then we got to the maximum point where Disney was just churning out Marvel content on streaming, in theaters, everywhere you look. And, you know, that was a little much. I don't think the kaiju realm has gotten there yet. Although that I guess that depends on if you count the indie market, because there's a lot of indie kaiju stuff that's happening. SRS Cinema keeps importing so many different things or distributing more local things. But I think it's somewhere between mainstream and underground. Like obviously something like the Monsterverse, Godzilla in general, King Kong, so forth. That's going to be the mainstream stuff, the stuff that everybody knows. Something that's a bit more obscure, like the Gamera Rebirth anime, like Yuzo Biggest Battle in Tokyo, like Reigo and Raiga and Monster Seafood Wars and Monster X Strikes Back and all that, they're going to be more in the die-hard fandom range, where you don't know they exist unless you are really steeped in the kaiju fandom. The mainstream isn't necessarily going to know as much. So I don't think we're quite to the superhero level yet. Superheroes are everywhere. They're still technically everywhere. We don't know if the bubble has truly burst yet, though it looks like it. At the very least, I would say the Marvel bubble has burst, and they're just not ready to admit it yet. Could that mean that DC will have its time finally? Well, we'll see what happens when Superman comes along. But maybe it's possible that superhero movies just in general are on their final legs. But kaiju movies are nowhere near the way superhero movies were. They're also nowhere near the way Westerns were back in the golden age of Hollywood. So, yeah, they're more popular than they've been in a while. I don't necessarily think they're that big as yet. Let's see. First question would be, between Toby Andrew and Tom Holland's Spider-Man, which is your favorite? Well, I've never really clicked with the MCU Spider-Man. It's not that the movies are bad per se. It's just like we're three movies in, and I don't feel like Peter Parker's character has actually made any progress. Literally all three of those movies somehow involve him being in Iron Man's shadow. And now apparently Spidey's going to play a major role when Robert Downey Jr.'s Doctor Doom comes along. So same thing, different coat. He's always going to be in RDJ's shadow, it feels like. But also, I don't know, that there's something not relatable about that version of Spider-Man. Part of the whole idea of why Spider-Man is considered one of the greatest superheroes of all time is that even with all the fantastical elements of the web slinging and the villain fighting and everything, he could be any one of us, right? Because he also faces a lot of everyday problems. How is he going to make rent? How is he going to get to his job on time? Things like that. And thus far, MCU Spidey is not relatable. Like, excuse me, for the first two movies, he's going to this really prestigious high school. He's being mentored by one of the greatest superheroes in the world, who's also one of the most brilliant innovators in the world. And there's no mention of Uncle Ben or him having any real struggles. Far From Home even ends with this ridiculous thing where his biggest problem is going to be that he's been framed for committing genocide in an alternate dimension. Just like we've all gone through. you know? And then that's the whole rest of the movie, right? He's dealing with the fallout of being an interdimensional terrorist. So he asks a wizard to rewrite reality around him so he doesn't have to deal with that anymore, only to break reality itself. So he learns that going for the simple solution of using magic to solve your problems isn't actually going to solve anything, which means the only solution left is to ask the wizard to do the spell again and rewrite history around him, only this time he's doing some sort of self-sacrificial thing, which is apparently going to get him to the point where he is like the Spider-Man in the comics, and nobody's going to remember him. And I guess that's what Christmas is really about, because there's a Christmas tree at the end for some reason. Where's the relatability there? I don't see it. Nothing against Tom Holland or anything, but like, this is just not. It feels like the whole Spider-Man essence was missed in the MCU. Andrew Garfield's version, I like Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. He had a good costume, good performance. There are moments that are good, but overall, the movies themselves, in general, I understand why the movies only lasted those two, because it felt kind of like they didn't really have a clear direction. Or anytime they wanted to go in a clear direction, the studio stepped in and went, wait a minute, let's save it for later. And later never came. But there are still those moments where Garfield Spider-Man feels like a good Spider-Man, like that whole being on a street level thing, and where he's not just fighting the bad guys, he's also trying to be there for people, to be a positive influence, to be encouraging to kids who are being bullied and things like that. So then you have Tobey's Spider-Man, and obviously there's going to be a little bit of nostalgia there for me, because those were the first Spider-Man movies and I was younger when I saw them. They've got something about them. I think it's actually the fact that you could describe them more as monster movies than your traditional superhero movies, that kind of makes them work in a way that other superhero movies don't generally capture. It's weird. There are actually quite a few superhero movies that when I think about them, they feel more like monster movies. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, the Tim Burton Batman movies, things like that. So I guess I would give it to those original three, but Andrew Garfield's comes in at a close second, and I just am not feeling it with Tom Holland. I'm sorry to any MCU fans out there. But let's see. Is this one? I was wondering if the upcoming MonsterVerse film experienced a sudden and drastic tonal shift from campy and insane back to deeply serious and grounded. Do you think it will? Think it will be received? Yeah, I think it could work, because what was the one thing everybody was doing, even though so many of us said it wasn't worth doing? They were comparing Godzilla X Kong to Godzilla -1 and saying Godzilla -1 is better. Why? Because it's the more serious movie, the more grounded movie, and things like that. Obviously, there's a lot more to why -1 works so well. But I think now that people have seen that and they're looking for a movie like that, if the MonsterVerse went more in that direction, it would, as long as it's done well, it would be well received. But I do think they might have to temper it a little bit. Like, you don't want to make the hard turn into from campy to dark and gritty. Maybe just sort of start going in that direction gently. I don't know. Let's see. Do you plan on releasing another short story collection like Assorted Absurdities? Hopefully one day. I do have a couple other short stories I've been working on. Some of them featuring recurring characters, some of them featuring just standard one-off things. Not all of them part of the grander story I'm telling. But, at this point, I'm also focusing on different full-length novels. One of them is going to be a short story anthology, but with a recurring character throughout. So you got that to look forward to. But yeah, something else like Assorted Absurdities is hopefully on the plan. Maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't, but Monster Apocalypse seems to be coming back. What do you think on doing an update video? I haven't heard that. Last I heard, Monster Apocalypse kind of lost everybody after that one Kickstarter campaign, but well, I guess I'll have to look into that. We will see. Your favorite Showa era Gamera movie or movies and why? That's an interesting one. They're all definitely a bit weirder than your average kaiju movies. Um, I did find surprisingly that Gamera versus Jiger worked pretty well on multiple levels, partly because it was so bizarrely weird and Cronenbergian in its violence. The Gauss one, of course, introduces the most iconic Gamera villain, but it's difficult to say when it comes to the Showa Gamera movies because there's always going to be a little something about them. And the easy answer would be to say Gamera versus Barugan because that's the only one that tried to actually be serious and not be a kid's movie. But, does that really make it better? It makes it different from the rest, and Barugan is certainly an interesting monster, one of the few ice-based monsters. There haven't been many of those. There's Barugan, there's a couple of Ultra monsters, then nothing happened for a while, and Shimo comes along. So that's the best I can answer. They've all got a little something. How is Dynamite? Well, she's doing quite well. She's resting right now, but she's doing well. Doesn't really like the winter because it's too cold to go outside, and she's very much an outdoor dog. But then again, none of us are really going out much when you're facing winter in the Northeast. What else we got here? Just scanning for some other questions. Do you have any hopes for the next Avengers movie, and what are your predictions? Honestly, I was kind of done with Marvel after Endgame. That just felt like the end. The only one I've been back to since to actually see in theaters was Guardians of the Galaxy 3, just to get the closure on those characters. And while I liked that one, like even that one, they had to work around stuff like, oh, Gamora was dead, but she's back, but not really. And it wasn't perfect. So if that's the best that the MCU can do, and even that's not fully 100% there, and of course, then eventually I did see the stuff like Thor: Love and Thunder and all those other things. I don't know. I don't really care about the MCU anymore. The MCU I feel like it reached its ending. I really didn't feel like experiencing the story after that because that felt like it should have been where it stopped. And arguably, I think a lot of people are feeling that way these days. So obviously, they're going to be bringing in Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom. I think that's more of a stunt than anything else because they really don't understand what fans are looking for. We loved seeing Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Yes, Robert Downey Jr. is very talented. He can play a lot of different roles, and I'm really glad he had a comeback after that darker period he went through. But bringing him back as Doctor Doom is not the point, right? It's not a question of, oh, we want to see this actor again. It's just a stunt. That's all I can really say about it. So I don't really have any predictions. I predict, if anything, it's probably going to be undergoing a bunch of reshoots again, like all the others. And who knows? If enough Marvel movies fail, it's quite possible that the MCU might not even last that much longer. We will see, though. We will see. Any other? What would the Nausicaa characters think of specific Godzilla characters? I don't know. They probably think it's way too much for them to handle. How about Mothra Leo in the MonsterVerse? Yeah, I know Mothra Leo's the son of Mothra. I've seen the Mothra trilogy and survived. Could be interesting. It would be an interesting way to expand on Mothra's mythology a little. Have maybe not necessarily have it be that Leo is specifically the son of Mothra, but maybe it's a subspecies, or well, maybe I don't know. That could be an interesting direction to go if they ever get around to making a solo Mothra movie. Any thoughts on continuing a radio series from a few years back? Oh, yeah, the new Aberdeen tapes. I've said in the past, part of the reason I had to cancel that, a very significant part, in fact, was that one of my voice actors sadly passed away during the lockdowns and just didn't feel right to continue after that. But I don't want it to be that. I don't want that to be all. I am trying to figure out some way to make it work. Maybe do a reboot, tighten it up a little, have more of a direct plan going into it. But I don't know if it would be a continuation. For all I know, it might be a segment on the animated series when that comes along. Like, have it be just a little way to, like, set it up so you have the characters just sort of sitting around. There's a radio playing and they're just listening to it. Maybe there's something funny happening in the background. I don't know. But I do want it to come back one day. The new Aberdeen tapes, I know people really liked it. And I liked it too. I was having fun with it. It was not easy because I was putting everything together myself. I had my voice actors, of course, doing their stuff, but I still had to put it all together on my own. That was a lot of work, which is why it took so long. But at least I was able to get a complete season out. Let's see. Godzilla -1 finally vindicates the remark in the series MASH, where Hawkeye Pierce says she flattened me like she was Godzilla and I was Tokyo, since MASH takes place from 1950 to 1953. Yep. Okay, there you have it. Godzilla -1 is part of the MASH universe. And now we just have to figure out how long MASH actually does take, because technically the Korean War did last between 1950 and 1953. MASH ran way longer than that, though, and the dates are all over the place. But I actually think that would be hilarious to actually have it confirmed. Like, somebody throw that towards Takashi Yamazaki. Ask him if MASH and Godzilla -1 exist in the same timeline. And then that would maybe create an excuse for why there are Godzilla movies mentioned, like Godzilla versus the Bobby Soxer and whatnot. Have you read the James Patterson Shadow novels? What are your thoughts? I haven't yet. I need to track down more of the written Shadow material. I do have plenty of the radio shows on CD, and I recently acquired the 3 earliest film adaptations of the Shadow. Although technically not adaptations. It's complicated. You'll see when I do the video. Have you seen Back to the Future? And if so, do you like it? Have I seen Back to the Future? I don't know who hasn't. Seen all 3 of them. I do think they're good. I mean, it's considered one of the best cinematic trilogies for a reason, right? First movie, of course, is iconic. You can't really watch the second movie without then watching the third movie. You kind of have to watch those 2 back to back, or in succession, I guess I should say. But they are good movies. I don't know why you had to do a Broadway musical out of it, but I guess the whole idea of only recognizable IPs has also infected the theater. It's not just a Hollywood thing, my friends. Let's see. I I have to scroll down a little. A lot of comments have been coming in. Your top favorite novels, if you can list them. I mean, there some of the obvious classics make their way on there, like To Kill a Mockingbird, Doyle's The Lost World, things like that. Um, it's kind of similar to the movie question. It's I don't know if I necessarily have a favorite that I would elevate above all others. If it counts as a novel, I'm really a huge fan of James Gurney's Dinotopia, although that's an illustrated one. But I think it really does sort of depend on what I'm. I don't know. I feel like I don't necessarily like any one novel or one short story or something over others. I certainly do have series that I would prefer over others, and plenty of books that I've just dropped. But um, hmm, yeah, sorry, that's the best I can do. Let's see. Do you think Godzilla vs. M or a similar concept of a human mutating into a monster could be pulled off in a Godzilla movie? Possibly. They were planning to do a Godzilla versus Frankenstein at one point, and Frankenstein's technically connected to humans. It'd have to be done a very particular way, though. Let's see. I don't know why he said M, unless that must be a fan project. My brother thinks it was Doctor Strange's fault that the events of Far From Home happened, even though I personally think it was mostly Peter's fault. What are your thoughts on that, Omni? Well, the whole idea is that Peter shouldn't have gone to Doctor Strange for the easy solution in the first place. So, and he interrupts him during the spell all of those different times, which is what brings the villains in. So yeah, it's Peter's fault. Again, how is that a relatable thing that people go through? Are there that many wizards that people go to ask for help with their everyday struggles? Favorite iteration of Godzilla? Not favorite movie, but favorite take on the character. Interesting. I have really liked the MonsterVerse version. I think that's a good distillation of things. I also kind of like how he is in the Showa Mechagodzilla movies, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla, where he's still the hero, but he's back to a more serious form. So, he's not necessarily going to be the campy version of the hero. He's the darker version of the hero, which does lead to certain things like after Titanosaurus is no longer being controlled, he still attacks and kills the poor thing. But, or maybe he doesn't, you never know. But I found that version to be really good. Plus, he has some really good entrances. His entrance in Terror of Mechagodzilla has frequently come up in the various One Monstrous moments from over the years. Check out those playlists if you're interested. Some people have done some really good stuff for those. There's some smaller channels out there that definitely could use the support. Still scrolling. Have I read the Godzilla Encyclopedia by Shinji Nishikawa? Not yet. It's on my list, though. I think Ghidorah was done too early for MonsterVerse, and as a writer, how would you have King Ghidorah last longer than was shown in King of the Monsters? And don't do Rodan dirty. Well, first of all, I would never do Rodan dirty. He's one of my favorites. As I've spoken before about how I think King Ghidorah wasn't used too early. If you look at the arc that they were going for, building up to Godzilla vs. Kong as their big event, it made sense. Because first of all, GVK was going to be told from Kong's perspective, with him being the underdog. But you also have to somehow separate the two and make it clear that there is an underdog story. Based on just Godzilla 2014 and Kong Skull Island, they seemed pretty equal. In fact, some people were convinced that Kong had the advantage for occasionally weird reasons, but I won't get into all of that. So the way you have to establish that Godzilla is the top dog is you gotta have him beat his most powerful opponent, and that's King Ghidorah. Well, some would say Mechagodzilla, but Ghidorah is the archenemy, right? So once you do that, you have established Godzilla as truly powerful. And now Kong's got something to struggle against. Plus, that plays into the whole man versus God theme that they were going for in the movie. How do you establish that Godzilla is the godlike one? You have him beat the devil with 3 heads. Now, how would I have made him last a little longer? Probably just by ending King of the Monsters with Ghidorah fleeing as opposed to being killed. Although, keeping the villain alive is not standard practice when it comes to American movies for some reason. They always find a way to kill them, with very few exceptions. It was actually kind of more surprising when a movie ended, like a superhero movie, ended with the villains alive. I think one of the first ones that really stood out to me doing that was the 2003 Daredevil movie with Ben Affleck and Michael Clark Duncan and all those guys. Because none of the major characters died in that one. And yet, it didn't get a sequel. By the way, director's cut, superior to the theatrical cut of that movie. And no, I don't know what to. I'm not really going to bother with Daredevil Born Again because Netflix Daredevil was okay, but I'm just not feeling it. What's a kaiju movie that never got a sequel that you feel could have or should have? Well, I mean, Gorgo clearly set things up for a sequel, and that never happened. They could have run with that. Seems like Titanic Creations is going to be doing that now, though. And, of course, there were the Steve Ditko comics. What else? Well, obviously that's the first one that comes to mind. As far as others go, it's always tricky to say. You never can tell sometimes how much juice certain things have to keep them going. I mean, who would have guessed that Godzilla after 1954 would have lasted as long as he has? But Gorgo certainly is the first one that comes to mind. Do you think we should have new Godzilla novels? Monsterverse novels can only scratch a certain itch for so long. Well, there are the translated novels of the novelizations of the movies, although that's kind of the same thing. And, I do think there would be a market for it because there is a market for kaiju novels out there. Although, like I said, it's also still kind of a niche thing. But, Godzilla is generally considered more of a movie character, so it'd be tricky. I think you'd have to have the novelizations do really, really, really well in order to convince Toho specifically that an original Godzilla novel would be something that would work. It could work, of course. Just gotta, again, find the right formula for it. Thoughts on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids? I assume the movie, because there was a series. It's a fun little 80s sci-fi comedy. I don't have any strong opinions about it, really. What is something you don't want to see in the Godzilla -1 sequel, if that's what the next Toho film actually is? Thank you for specifying that. Well, I do think I'd want to see another monster show up. And actually have there be something going on between that monster and Godzilla. I don't necessarily want it to be exactly like Godzilla Raids Again, but I do think they could definitely take the subtext of that movie of the two superpowers of the Cold War duking it out with Japan caught in the middle, and really expand on that with Godzilla and whatever the other monster winds up being, representing that, if that's what they wanted to go with. Takashi Yamazaki did say he wants to tell a good story first, and any meaning he might put into it is not his main priority, which, that's how a good story is written. The meaning is the subtext. But would there be anything else? I wouldn't want to see the plot repeated. If they're bringing the original cast back, I don't want to see the characters go through the exact same stuff as before. They've got to move forward. There are too many sequels out there with returning characters where it's just a rehash of what the last movie did. That's kind of gotten away from it. We've kind of gotten away from that as movies became a bit more serialized with the shared universes and all, but there's always the risk that can still happen. So that would be the main thing I would want them to avoid. Who do you think would win Godzilla against camera? Well, I mean, Godzilla steps on a camera, and that's the last picture or film that it ever takes. I'm just taking that at face value, and I'm leaving it there. Let's see. If Gamera was introduced in the MonsterVerse, how would you go about making a crossover movie with Godzilla? Would you have them fight or make it a mostly team-up movie? I actually think it would make more sense for Godzilla and Gamera to team up than it would for Godzilla and Kong. Like, sort of establish that maybe the Gamera species is another one of those species that has a symbiotic relationship with Godzilla. It's similar to how it is with Mothra. And that could be an interesting way to pair them together. It also avoids the whole versus thing, because there's always going to be that question of who's going to win, right? And no matter what you go with, someone's going to be dissatisfied. So why not just have them team up from the beginning? People have wanted to see them fight, sure, but I think more people would want to see them team up. I want to see them team up anyway. And for the MonsterVerse, I feel like that would make the most sense. Do you think Jurassic World Rebirth will be better than Dominion? Well, Dominion was definitely the weakest of the Jurassic World trilogy. Like, I saw it again a little bit ago after it was finally on streaming, and I thought, yeah, this doesn't hold up on a second viewing much. I had a fun time seeing it in the theater the first time, but seeing it again just was sort of like, yeah, no, they really didn't know what to do. So, but will Rebirth be better? That is a very tricky thing to consider, because like, it feels kind of like Rebirth exists just because Universal wants to keep making Jurassic Park movies. There really was no reason to do it. They said Dominion was going to be the end of it, but obviously it wasn't. They brought it right back, and the only other dinosaur movie we've gotten since then was 65, which was not good. Primitive War is coming, but news on that seems to be really slow. So, I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical, because this really does feel like it's making the movie just to make the movie and keep raking in the Jurassic Park money. Not that I am surprised, but will that result in something good? Maybe they'll get lucky. Maybe not. Excuse me. Throat's a little dry. What monsters would you like to see get a story animation from Lost Utopia Films? Those are the one. He's the one. That's the channel that does like the found footage, mockumentary, analog horror stuff, right? Well, his Living with Monsters thing, if I am remembering this correctly, definitely set up some plenty of stuff to keep going. He could always reach out to me, and I could work with him on something like that for Operation Red Dragon. You never know. What are your preferences on separating the art from the artist because of the recent Neil Gaiman allegations? I've been a bit on edge on whether I can still enjoy the books I already own. Well, separating the art from the artist is a very complicated issue because sometimes the artist is making it very clear that the art does represent exactly what he thinks and feels. Other times, it's not so obvious. Sometimes the artist might very well think the exact opposite and just was telling a story for the heck of it, or because he was told to tell the story that way or something. But the way I see it, the what the artist does apart from the work he does, if he does something horrible, I don't think that should directly. I know what I want to say, but my thoughts are a little jumbled for some reason. Okay, let me put it this way. Some of this conversation about separating the art from the artist sometimes comes around to the audience, which not that the audience had anything to do with what the artist did, but it's the question of if you still like what the artist did despite knowing, if you still like what the artist made despite knowing what he has been accused of, does that reflect on you? I personally don't think it does. Like, Roman Polanski before this did something pretty darn awful, and he fled the country in order to escape the consequences. But I don't think that reflects on people who like the way he makes movies. You can still like the movie Chinatown and think it's a well-made movie and not approve of what Roman Polanski did, right? Now, I'm not really a big fan of Roman Polanski because I'm just not that big a fan of his style compared to other directors. But if I were to meet someone who did like Roman Polanski's work, not necessarily Roman Polanski the person, you know, unless I detected some serious red flags, I wouldn't necessarily judge them for that. With the Neil Gaiman thing, I certainly think there is a similar matter because, there are people who have been saying that they've seen stuff in some of Neil Gaiman's stories that sounds an awful lot like the allegations that are being leveled against him. Now, me as a person who believes in the idea of innocent until proven guilty, I look at that and I wonder, does that mean he was writing out his fantasies and then acting them out with these real people? Or are these real people just taking stuff from his stories and claiming that they really happened? At this point, we don't know. We only have the allegations, and he is getting dropped from a lot of things. Nothing's actually gone to court yet, as far as I can tell. But it's a personal choice, I think. If you don't feel comfortable reading Neil Gaiman's stuff anymore because of the allegations, and if the allegations even turn out to be true, let's say, then go right ahead and stop reading him if it really makes you feel that uncomfortable. I'm an H.P. Lovecraft fan myself. Lovecraft, of course, long dead, so he's not directly benefiting from sales of his stuff, but he also had some pretty bad opinions, things I don't agree with, his views on race and everything. And yet for some reason he was also a feminist. So, he was supported women's rights, didn't necessarily approve of people who weren't white. But he was complex, I guess, is the most generous way you can put it, but didn't make his opinions any more tolerable. And they always found a way into his writing in some capacity. Or, well, not always, but a lot of the time. But I can read those things, not have it directly affect my outlooks on race. I'm not going to read the facts in the case of Arthur German and come out of it thinking that interracial marriage is horrible. I don't believe that at all. It's not going to change. It's not going to turn me into a racist. But I can certainly look at it and see it as an interesting case study of how this man, like a view into Lovecraft's psyche. But then again, there's the distance there, right? With the Neil Gaiman stuff, he's still alive. This is all fresh. I think you got to go case by case sometimes with separating the art from the artist. But I don't think if you choose to keep reading Neil Gaiman stuff, if the allegations turn out to be true, I don't necessarily think that reflects badly on you for wanting to keep reading them. You're not reading them because you approve of what Neil Gaiman's been accused of. You read them because you enjoy the story, right? And if the story isn't reflective of those things, I hope all of that makes sense. Again, what he's accused of doing, allegedly, like I said, nothing's gone to court yet. Nothing's been proven. It's just allegations. If it turns out to be true, it's horrible. But, that doesn't necessarily mean all of his work reflects that. But, history will show us what happens, I suppose. Time is always marching forward. Had I been expecting that question, I might have been able to prepare an answer that was a little bit better. Have you seen the Harry Potter films? And if so, do you have favorite creatures? I actually never got into Harry Potter, just wasn't interested. Although everyone around me was. There was a period of time where I could have told you, you could have given me a random page number and I could have told you exactly what happened on that page without ever having read the books, because that's how much people around me were talking about them. I can't do that anymore. But yeah, I don't have any favorite creatures from Harry Potter because I just never got into Harry Potter. I don't, not like I'm hating it, just not that big, just never got into it. I know I've asked on Facebook, will the new Aberdeen tapes be rebooted? Well, I did address that. I want to bring it back at some point. So just help keep the channel going, help with the support, and it'll come back one day. Favorite female voice actors and why? Well, let's see. Why am I suddenly blanking on... Hold on. I just want to look it up and confirm the name here. I have this thing about occasionally being nervous about getting names wrong. All right. I don't know why I blanked on this, but Tress MacNeille, I think, was... I say was as if she's gone. She's really talented. Like, she's older now, so her voice has lost some of its range, but, she could do a lot. There was that one early episode of Tiny Toon Adventures where she was impersonating some of the other characters, and she was so close to being exactly on point with them. Like I said, her range has kind of diminished a little since she's gotten older, but she definitely, in her peak, she had some really good range. I'm gonna have to look up some more. I might have to actually do... I might do a full video on this. I don't know, but voice acting in itself is such an interesting art. So, but yeah, I would say, like, one of the greatest voice ranges I've heard was from Tress MacNeille. Why am I leaning in? I keep doing this. Um, if you could write a movie based on one of the urban legends, such as Jersey Devil, Bigfoot, Loch Ness, etc., how would you go about it? Well, that's partly getting into spoilers for upcoming projects. I am, in fact, writing a novel about the Jersey Devil's adventures throughout history, as based on how the character is depicted in Occult Mafia 2. So you'll be able to find that out once that's done, and it'll incorporate a few other interesting things into it as well. Um, but I don't want to give too much away about that because you know, I want it to be a surprise. In terms of other things, though, like, well, you just might find out one day. There's plenty more stories to come. But I would definitely like to bring in some stuff that's not as well known per se. Like everybody when they're doing a Bigfoot thing talks about stuff like the Patterson Gimlin film and things like that. What I've always thought would be interesting would be for people to focus more on the Ape Canyon incident, because that's a very interesting early Bigfoot encounter. Small Town Monsters is actually going to be doing a documentary about it uh, sometime this year, I think. And the basic premise is that it was during the gold rush. This is a real event, by the way. There is an actual place where this happened that you can go to. That just this place called Ape Canyon. Why is it called Ape Canyon if it's in the American West where there are no apes? Well, back in the gold rush, there were some prospectors who were going out. They were sure that they were going to find gold in this particular region. They set up they threw together a log cabin to spend the night, and suddenly they found the cabin surrounded by these hairy wild men who were throwing rocks and trying to break in. And that morning the prospectors hightailed it out of there. So crazy story. I'm surprised no one's done a movie of that yet or used it as the jumping off point for a story. But now you know it, so who knows? Let's see. Have you ever read any of Peter Benchley's novels like Jaws or Beast? Do you think the adaptations are better than the books? I started to read Jaws a while ago. I never got too far in it. Not because I didn't think it was good, but because I just kind of lost track of it among everything else. But what I read of it, I remember being good. I don't know if I read enough to determine if it was better than the movie. I mean, there's always that mindset, right? That the book is always better. But that's the best I can do. Like I said, I only read Jaws up to a certain point and kind of lost track of it. What cryptid do you think you would be the most frightened of if you saw it in person? Probably those giant spiders that they say are in Africa. Like the ones that are the size of a barnyard animal. Because I have a thing about big spiders. Little spiders, they don't bother me. The big ones, no. My skin is starting to crawl just thinking about it. So that's as far as like a more animalistic cryptid would go. Something that's more along the lines of Mothman, where there's more of an existential dread to be felt. I mean, obviously, I'd probably be a little freaked out there. I don't know. I might be surprised by. I might feel fear depending, because the thing about a cryptid is it's not supposed to be there, right? And then you see it. So I haven't been freaked out by any of the UFOs I've seen, although I don't know what those UFOs were. So if I'd had a better idea of what they might have been, and it turned out they were something really out there, I mean, who knows how I would have reacted then. But just seeing something unusual that I can't identify, my primary thought is, well, that's weird. Looks like we have something that's split into two parts. Something funny I've noticed I've been doing when writing is I make a very scary monster or person and give them something silly, like a silly name or goofy trait. I mostly started doing that because most evil people just have normal names and most scary things have a funny thing about them. I was wondering what you thought about that. You know, that's actually pretty interesting. Like, I get what he's saying. It's kind of like the Pumpkinhead, right? If you haven't seen Pumpkinhead, it's one of those things that the most common thing you're going to hear people say about Pumpkinhead is it's better than a movie called Pumpkinhead has any right to be, because it sounds like a goofy name. This sort of weird little local folk tale creature from the deep, deep south in Appalachia, where they still don't have phones to this day. And yet, when you actually see it, it is one of the most horrifying vengeance demons ever. So, there is an interesting way to go about that. Sort of like the reason that the name Pumpkinhead works so well is because it tells you something about the region he comes from. Like I said, deep south, sort of a Cajun redneck sort of area, very isolated, very steeped in its traditions, and they would tell tales of a boogeyman named the Pumpkinhead that would come and get you, and have a little rhyme that the children would recite and everything. And that would create the folklore around it. But then the movie is about showing it's not just folklore, it's reality. And the name is masking the terror that exists. So I actually do kind of like the idea of being able to do that. You know, you can also do that with cryptids. You know, there are a lot of Bigfoot horror movies. Bigfoot is not necessarily an intimidating name. It's kind of a silly name, but a killer Bigfoot movie, the Bigfoot is always dangerous. When done right, it can be a downright terrifying thing. So yeah, the question was specifically, what are my thoughts on that? I do like the idea. You don't necessarily want to overuse it, but when it's done well, it can be done really, really well. Do you think Godzilla vs. Hedorah should have gotten a sequel? Would you have liked to have seen what Yoshimitsu Banno had planned? Well, one of the things I said earlier, right, is a sequel ideally shouldn't just be a rehash. And based on the initial pitch for the Godzilla vs. Hedorah sequel, at least the one that I've seen floating around, the only thing that seemed different about it was that it would have been set in Africa. You know, assuming that actually what it is, and that wasn't one of those internet rumors that just floated around for a while. But I kind of feel like Godzilla vs. Hedorah said everything it intended to say. What more can you say after that? Like, first movie, pollution is bad. Second movie, pollution is bad again. And there were plenty of anti-pollution movies after that. Like Godzilla vs. Gigan still had the pollution theme in it with the Nebula M Space Hunter cockroaches. Although that wasn't really the focus, was it? It was sort of an element, but not the main thing. So I don't know. I think it was fine just as a standalone thing. Assuming you think it was fine, of course. What's your favorite Heisei era and Millennium era Godzilla films? You know, when it comes to the Heisei era, I really do think that Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante were the top tier. So Return of Godzilla got the themes right. It had the atmosphere. It had the tone. It works on just about every level. Special effects might be a little up and down with the Cybok Godzilla and everything, but otherwise, solid movie. And Godzilla vs. Biollante had so much ambition behind it, and it set the standard for what the Heisei era would be going forward, and establishing characters and ideas and whatnot. So those two are definitely the top for me. Godzilla 2000 is good, but I think Godzilla 2000, when we get into the Millennium Era, that's a good starting point for fans. Like, if you have a friend who wants to know what Godzilla is all about, Godzilla 2000 kind of encompasses everything you would expect from a Godzilla movie. And I've said that before. It has a Godzilla that's destructive, but is also a hero. So you get both the good and the bad Godzilla. You have an interesting opponent who's also an alien. You have human characters that are endearing, and you care just enough about them to want to see them pull through or get what's coming to them, depending. But they also know to step aside when it's time for the monsters to take center stage, and you don't necessarily miss them for that brief moment when they're away. And then, of course, GMK, the ridiculously long titled one, that was on a whole other level. It had, again, good balance of themes, good monster depictions, good human characters. For some of you, this isn't new information, but I am answering these questions as they come. What do you think is the best non-Godzilla or Gamera kaiju? I'm also going to count King Kong as not part of the list, because obviously King Kong is everybody's favorite. As I think about it, I mean, the pool is only so big, of course, but I think Rego really worked. Specifically Rego. Not so much Raiga, but that first Rego movie, Deep Sea Monster Rego versus Battleship Yamato, that was really solid. Not still weird at times, but the way Rego was depicted, that had that unique hydrodynamic design, the setting of World War II, the rivalry with the most iconic battleship in the Japanese fleet. Rego was really good. And a monster that I kind of wish we'd seen more of that one. And yeah, Raiga is like the land-based version, but specifically Rego I would want to see come back. Gilala is good for just sheer ridiculousness. We all remember the first time we saw Gilala and thought, really? Who came up with that ridiculous thing? But of course, Gilala has ingrained itself into our minds, right? It's so ridiculous that you can't help but kind of like it. And it's been the subject of a serious movie and a comedic movie. So there's definitely some strength there. And is there anything else that's coming to mind that's not Godzilla or Gamera or Kong or any of those? See, it's tricky because not every kaiju from Toho necessarily crossed over with Godzilla, but they could be still counted as Godzilla monsters. So if something comes to mind, like, say, Space Amoeba, well, those monsters have appeared with Godzilla since then, even though the movie itself never officially crossed over. So once you gotta narrow it down, and of course, then you have stuff like Yamato Orochi, or Yamato Takeru, Orochi the Eight-Headed Dragon. It's the two titles. It's hard to get separated. Oh, wait a minute. Technically not Gamera, from the same studio though. Daimajin. Daimajin's a pretty good kaiju. If you count it as a kaiju. I mean, the techniques are all there. I am planning to do a Daimajin video at some point soon. Have your thoughts on the anime trilogy changed at all? Personally, I think they're garbage, but that's just me. Oh, it's not just you. My thoughts have not changed in the slightest. If they have, it's only for the worse. Because anytime I find myself discussing them in any way, something else comes to mind that makes me think, oh, that's actually makes it even worse than I already thought. Like a recent debate over on TwitX that happened, and I realized, wait a minute, Haruo, by offing himself and making that kamikaze run at Godzilla, only proves the villain right. He only proves that Mephius is not wrong and that his nihilism is justified. And that's not what the movie should have done. So, yeah. No love for the anime trilogy at all. That's and I don't think Toho has any love for it left either. Like when it was new, that's what the Godzilla store was primarily pushing. Nowadays, not so much. What unused Godzilla movie idea would you want to see on the screen? I'd like to see Bagon finally show up. Bagon's always supposed to be in the movies and never does make it for some reason. He got a Bandai figure. There was supposedly that Mothra versus Bagon short film, but I keep hearing that nothing ever came of that, except he might have appeared on Godzibon or whatever that puppet show is. But does that even count? We need to have him actually be in a movie. Maybe that'll be Godzilla -2 or whatever Yamazaki's sequel winds up being. There's a director's cut of Daredevil? Oh, yes, there is. And it's not one of those director's cuts where it's just like, hey, there's 1 or 2 minutes of footage that was not in the theatrical version. This is like 30 minutes. There was an entire subplot, entire characters that were not in the theatrical version. And once they're back in, the movie makes so much more sense. They even take out some of the things that were added to try and cover over the fact that those scenes were gone. And again, it works so much better. If you see one version of the 2003 Daredevil, see the director's cut. The theatrical cut is just Tim Burton's Batman light. The director's cut, though, is what the theatrical cut should have been. But it also probably would have upped the rating, which is why it got trimmed all to oblivion. How do you create a new villain for Kong specifically? Well, let's see. Just giving him another Kong to fight against in the form of Scar King was actually a pretty big deal. Like, we've never seen something like that before. Dinosaurs are too obvious. He's always fought those, and same with snakes and everything. And Godzilla, of course, there's that rivalry. So what would a new Kong villain be? Something that would give him a real challenge. He's never really fought against something that flies, has he? Like, we kind of got a taste of that with the Warbats in Godzilla vs. Kong, but they stayed mostly close to the ground. I think if Kong had to deal with a flying opponent, well, there was the Pteranodon in the first movie, obviously, but like the whole point, I've said in the past, the whole point of showing Kong fight those different creatures in succession on Skull Island is to show he's the true master of that realm. He's the master of the land, the sea, and the air. He fights a T-Rex on the land. He fights that sea serpent that comes from the water, fights a Pteranodon that comes from the sky. But to give him a rival that can, in fact, fly and get away from him and present more of a challenge, that might be one way to do it. He had a flying ally in that awful Netflix cartoon that as far as I've heard, hasn't had much progress made on it. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Because, Kong can't fly, so he would already have a bit of a challenge there. What else we got? What were, in your opinion, the most disappointing finales of a show? Oh, man. Boy, gotta think about that one for a moment, because there have been some real... One that comes to mind is actually an anime series. Back when the Sci-Fi Channel, back when it was still the Sci-Fi Channel, in fact, did a Monday night anime block called Anime Monday, where they ran stuff from Manga Entertainment. They did a show called Toko, spelled Tokko. And it's sort of a like secret organization that hunts demons kind of series. And I watched it, and it was pretty good until it got to the end, and it doesn't even have an ending. Like, literally, it has no ending. It gets to a certain point in the story, and it's been building up all these different things that you're expecting to pay off, but then it just kind of reaches a point where it goes, we're gonna stop here. And it's not even like it did that because it's secretly a commercial for the manga where the story continues, because that's how the manga ends as well. And yeah, I remember thinking that was a huge letdown. And unfortunately, that can sometimes be an issue with anime, where they get to a certain point and it just kind of stops. It just peters out. But I don't want this to be exclusively anime focused. Anything else like that that was just left me unsatisfied in terms of how a show ended? It's hard to say because I'm not necessarily going to watch a show all the way to the end if it stops interesting me. And usually, if a show has a lackluster ending, it lost me before it got to that ending. And like I said, Toko is what came to mind first and foremost. And there are always going to be those lists that show the most shocking or darkest endings and everything. But I do remember specifically, Toko had no ending at all. And it doesn't have an ending in any form it takes. How would you bring in the Gargantuas to the Monsterverse? Well, can't do them as Frankensteins. They don't necessarily work as a subspecies of Kong either, although that would be the obvious thing to go with. What might be interesting is if they were clones of Kong. Like they got some genetic material that maybe not necessarily Monarch got it, but some other group, like spin off of the eco terrorists that Alan Jonah runs. They got their hands on some Kong DNA. They sold it to somebody, and it grew into these two mutant Kong creatures. One of them that's kind of close to the original, that would be Sanda, but then one of them mutates and becomes semi-aquatic, that's Gyra. So that's one idea. What else we got here? Do you find the fight between Godzilla and Kong in Egypt in the New Empire to be necessary, or do you think that it could have been left out of the film? I do think it's actually in character for Godzilla. Because, at that point, he's on a mission. He's gearing up for this apocalyptic event that he's been warned about. And any other monster that's gotten in his way, he said, I don't have time for you. Get out of my way. If you're knocked out of my way, you're toast. As far as he knows, Kong is just another monster getting in his way. So going after him when Kong suddenly shows up out of nowhere and roars a challenge, well, that's something he's got to deal with. He might very well think, knowing that Scar King is coming back, he might even have the thought that Kong might be siding with Scar King. I mean, we don't necessarily know, but it seems to me like there are plenty of reasons that you can think of that would explain Godzilla going after Kong at that particular moment. And again, even though they ended the last movie kind of on good terms, it didn't necessarily mean they were friends. So was it 100% necessary? That maybe there could have been a reason to cut it, but then again, I do think it was okay to keep in. It's not something I would have cut. Would Shimo count as the exception of the villain typically dying at the end of a movie, even though she was being forced to fight because of Scar King? Well, Shimo was freed by the end, as mentioned. She was only being forced to be a villain. So she wasn't technically a true villain. So not quite an exception in my book. Let's see. They can't get Destroyer for the Monsterverse. Could Bagon be a nice replacement? Possibly. I mean, Bagon's design was kind of utilized as Destroyer. Not exactly, but like they clearly took that base and thought, okay, how can we rework this? So maybe. Have you seen The Boy and the Heron? Not yet. Not yet. I am aware of it. It's on my list. In your opinion, do you think Kong could have killed Godzilla with the Beast Glove, even though he was evolved and therefore stronger, tougher, etc.? Probably not. The Beast Glove clearly did a bit more to Godzilla than Kong's bare fist would have done, but I don't think that necessarily means it would have taken Godzilla out. We know it wouldn't have because it didn't. Let's see. Did you read that new Nemesis novel by Jeremy Robinson? It kind of feels like it's a sequel to an unmade book in some places. I haven't yet. I've read the original Nemesis novels. I haven't read the new one, whether it's a reboot or whatever, but excuse me. No, haven't read it yet. Although, if it does have that issue, that's unfortunate. Do you think original monsters would work better for the MV or Toho Classic? I'd actually like to see Toho come up with some original monsters again. You know, I like seeing the classics reinvented and all, or not reinvented, but more upgraded for the modern day. Get some nice redesigns and everything. But I do kind of want them to bring in some new characters, some new monsters, because that's part of the beauty of the kaiju genre, right? Unlike superhero movies where getting a brand new character in an adaptation only happens once in a blue moon, kaiju movies can always introduce something new. So I'd like to see Toho come up with something new. The Monsterverse already is. That's not a problem there. Well, it might be a problem if you view them as substitutes for the classic monsters, but that's a whole other topic. Did you ever read the Mark Saraceni Godzilla novels? If so, what did you think of them? Oh yeah, I read them. I still have them packed away somewhere. They were pretty good. They're young adult novels, obviously, and I read them as a young adult. But I don't know if I would still enjoy them as much now. But I do remember them being very well written, of course. And it's a shame that the final one never actually happened because the 1998 movie came along and suddenly Godzilla's name was Mud. But yeah, they were solid. Although the one thing I always thought was weird was in the first one where they offer the solution of why don't we drop a nuke on Godzilla's head because that would overload him and vaporize him, and wouldn't that solve the problem? And no one has a counter argument to it, but they never actually do it. And there's no reason given, as far as I remember, other than just we don't want to drop a nuke. So, I don't know. Otherwise, I think they were good. How would you make a Godzilla anime? I do a Monster of the Week series. That's the simplest way to do it. Don't have this like ongoing. Well, you can have an ongoing story bridging the episodes together, but like don't stretch out the monster stuff for all of that. Like 3 episodes dealing with the Rodans and then the plot really begins. You don't need that. Just have Godzilla, have a monster. They fight there's a fight each episode, but you can have the ongoing plot with the humans. Gamera Rebirth, but with Godzilla monsters, you know? That's the most basic way to do it. Let's see. Do you write on paper first, or do you just go straight to the computer when writing? Oh, good. A writing question. I actually don't like handwriting. I like drawing. I actually prefer drawing on paper with a pen or pencil as compared to drawing on a tablet. But writing by hand, that I find that to be very uncomfortable. So I type. I go to the computer and I type first. And then I type second, and then I type all the way until I'm done. So that's for me. I know I actually really prefer that I have the option to type. Let's see. What are your hopes for the Primitive War movie? Um, well, one of my hopes is that it's not Jurassic Park, that it's different from those movies, but I also want it to actually be like there are plenty of dinosaur movies out there, right? They're the really cheap ones from the asylum and everything, but they're generally not very good per se. I want Primitive War to actually do something more interesting than what those movies do. You've already got an interesting idea with unleashing dinosaurs in the Vietnam War, right? But to really work, it's got to have something more to it. The Vietnam War setting already implies that they're probably going to be dealing with something thematic, but only time will tell. Maybe it will just wind up being a very high budget dino exploitation movie, as long as it's better than 65. I think this is a question. I feel like kaiju aren't really taken seriously as entertainment, even to the point of being unnecessarily hated by non-fans. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think that is? Well, yeah, there is that reputation. I think part of it is, well, no, not just a part of it. Most of it is just, I think, based on ignorance, because that's the way it generally is with this sort of thing. So what are superheroes to someone who's not a superhero fan? It's just kiddie entertainment for a disposable medium. But once you actually get into superheroes, and when superheroes went mainstream, people realized, oh, there's actually a lot more to superheroes than just that. With kaiju stuff, they have the unfortunate association with things like afternoon TV showings with the horror movie hosts that always made these quirky jokes during commercial breaks, or you had the Mystery Science Theater 3000 treatment. And MST3K didn't even cover that many kaiju movies, of course. But the thing is, to a more casual viewer, they're not necessarily going to know the difference between when they're doing Godzilla versus Megalon or Gamera versus Zigra or Gorgo or any of those others. They're just going to see the big rubber monsters, the cheesy special effects, the bad dubbing, and it's just going to be like, oh, well, that's all Japanese media then. At least that's how it started, I think. And that's not even necessarily me blaming those hosts and the Misty crew or anything. They were just having a little bit of fun. I don't think they were going out to try and ruin the reputations of cinema of the cinematic traditions of an entire country. It's just that it turned out that way. And that perception remains. And I think also that can feed into why Godzilla fans are often perceived as hating King Kong, because King Kong actually does get the respect. He's a giant monster fantasy movie realized with special effects that these days are considered outdated, even though they're still really good and good examples of stop motion, of course, but nobody does it anymore. But for some reason, King Kong gets a pass from even like the biggest of anti-kaiju cinephiles, because King Kong is considered a classic, but Godzilla isn't. The best you can say about Godzilla is a backhanded compliment. So yeah, there is that perception, but I do think it's mostly born out of ignorance. And I don't think the answer to that is to be hostile about it, of course. I think the answer is to just state the case. But then, of course, you're going to have people saying, well, why are you so insecure about it? I say, don't let them convince you that you are insecure. A really insecure person wouldn't be able to make a case for it. Do you play the mobile game Godzilla Battle Line? If so, can I battle you? I don't play mobile games. I barely play video games at all. I just started doing Let's Plays, although that took a while. But no, I don't play mobile games. I'm one of those weirdos who uses my phone mostly as a phone. What's the best non-Jurassic Park dinosaur movie in your opinion? Man, Jurassic Park really set the standard so high, but I mean, 1 Million Years BC is certainly a good dinosaur movie because it, as outlandish as it is, it's very well made. You have Ray Harryhausen doing some of his best dinosaur work. You've got a plot that's not told in English or any known language, and yet you can still follow it. It's got a natural plot progression to it. And that and dinosaurs, when dinosaurs ruled the earth, which kind of go hand in hand with each other, those are pretty darn solid as far as dinosaur movies go. I wouldn't consider it good, but Dinosaurus is a movie I had a lot of fun with. And I figure, yes, it's because it's kind of campy, but if I'm having fun, like I said earlier, that means I'm enjoying it. So I won't say anything bad about Dinosaurus. Like, I recommend watching it. It is fun. It's ridiculous, but it's fun. Did you watch the extended version of Jurassic World Dominion, or have you only seen the theatrical version? Come to think of it, I haven't seen the extended version yet. Although, how much could the extended version add? I know they added the prologue back in with the T-Rex at the drive-in. I need your help. I'm working on the MD series, trying to fill the universe, but I'm worried that it might go from hardcore to absurd. Like start with Pacific Rim and end Uprising or New Empire. Well, here's what I think. Pacific Rim Uprising, and for a brief moment, we are going to acknowledge that yes, there is a Pacific Rim sequel, but Uprising wasn't bad because it was outlandish. It was bad because it didn't make sense and it didn't carry through the themes of the original movie and didn't respect the original movie at all. I would have been okay with stuff like having the new plan be for the precursors to drop a kaiju into an active volcano and have that mean, and that's because their blood mixes with the lava and will cause an apocalyptic event. What I'm not okay with is when they say that was the plan from the beginning and the specific volcano they wanted to get to was in that direction, so they sent their first kaiju in this direction, and then every other kaiju they sent all over the place except in the one direction they were supposed to go that would have ended all of it. That was the thing that stuff like that is what made Pacific Rim Uprising bad. And also the fact that it didn't seem to understand that the movie's ideas of heroism and cooperation were not meant to be treated ironically. We're supposed to really buy into it. It's sincere. Uprising was a very insincere movie. It literally trolled us when the Jaegers are launched to the final battle. You can't get less sincere than that. So, the absurd elements, I wouldn't necessarily have had that big an issue with if the movie had been good in any other capacity. But, okay, I don't want this to be a critique about Pacific Rim Uprising because you're asking about help with your writing. What I would say is, obviously, make sure your story is remaining consistent. If you are going from more grounded to more absurd, you can do that. You just got to make sure you have a natural flow to it. But whatever you're going to do, make sure that at the end of the day, your story actually makes sense and you haven't lost that sincerity. That's the key. As long as you maintain those elements, I mean, you could get away with making it a full-blown screwball madcap cartoon. You could do it as Duck Amuck, and as long as it's sincere, it will work. I mean, that's the hope, right? Sometimes you never know until it's out there for people to provide feedback on. But hopefully that helps, or at least gives you a sense of direction. I'm not always sure if what I'm saying makes sense. I just spout out whatever comes to mind and hope for the best. If you had to rework the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla animated series for a modern audience, how would you do it so that it would be successful? Well, the Godzilla the series that spun off from the 1998 movie already kind of did that, didn't it? In a way. So, maybe just fuse the two, sort of have it be a mixture of those elements. That's the best that comes to mind at this point. What else we got here? Have you heard of Glitch Productions? And if so, have you seen Murder Drones or The Amazing Digital Circus? I actually have been watching The Amazing Digital Circus. Very interesting series so far. I've actually got a bit of a theory about those characters. You know how part of the idea is that they're real people trapped in a digital reality and they want to escape? I don't necessarily know if they can escape. And not because they can't find an exit. I'm thinking that it's either I'm thinking that either the characters are copies of the real people's consciousness, and those real people are still out in the real world doing their own thing, completely unaware that they've got mental copies of themselves trapped in this area, or their brains in a jar. And so if they did escape, they would have nothing to go back to but a disembodied brain. Although, I don't know if either of those are true, so we will see. Would you see a big budget Moby Dick remake on the IMAX? If there was an IMAX theater near me. Unfortunately, I don't think there is, but there are plenty of things I'd like to see in IMAX that I haven't been able to just because I tend not to live in places where there are any. So a crazy hypocrite HP was? Yeah. Well, yeah. Lovecraft had issues, and not just of Weird Tales magazine that featured his stories. Let's see what else. Just scanning for some questions. There's some conversations happening, and looks like they're interesting. Have you ever read the 2 Jurassic Park novels? I haven't read them myself, but when I was younger, my dad read them to me for bedtime stories, along with the Foundation series, as I've mentioned before. Do you fear Kumunga, considering, like me, you're arachnophobic? And where do you draw the line as a fellow arachnophobe? Weirdly enough, Kumunga doesn't bother me. I don't know why. He's a giant spider, but for some reason, I'm not bothered by him in the least. Maybe because he doesn't actually really look like one. Or maybe it's because he has pink eyes or something. I don't know. But as far as where I draw the line at my arachnophobia, if it's a tiny little thing, it's not going to bother me. I see a little spider crawling on the wall in my house. I'm just like, okay, you can build a web in a corner somewhere and catch any bugs that come in. I'll be fine. But if it were like a tarantula or something, no thank you. Absolutely not. And now I'm worried people are going to be sending me pictures of those things. Any kaiju you'd be most afraid of if they existed? I don't know. I mean, obviously, any kaiju that did exist, if it was coming towards me, I'm not going to stay in its way. How was your New Year's? Mine was good. I We just hung out. Hope yours was good too. Let's see. I get the heebie-jeebies seeing Russell Crowe. That's a cryptid, right? Well, from what I've heard, he only comes out rarely. What do you think of the concept of the Grim Reaper? Well, that's an interesting one. Definitely didn't expect that. Um, Interesting. I obviously don't necessarily think that's a real figure, but hmm, if used well, it could be an interesting thing. That, of course, used well can mean a lot of different things. As a frightening specter, it works, or if it's a cartoon like The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, where he constantly gets humiliated, that also worked. How horrifying do you think Ghidorah's home planet might be? What if he doesn't have a home planet? Think on that for a while. Let's just scrolling through. Thoughts on Gappa, both the movie and the monster designs? For some reason, Gappa is actually something that's always been on my radar, but I haven't managed to actually sit down and watch yet. I think the designs are interesting, but Gappa is one of the things I plan to review this year. Did you know anything about murder drones besides the fact that I draw them? Oh, I mean, I've seen bits and pieces of it, but haven't sat down to do the whole thing yet. So, interesting though that you draw them. I mean, I'll check him out at some point. What would you do if you can write a Ray Harryhausen inspired movie like they did with the Primevals? What would be the story theme with myth and legend, sci-fi, or prehistory, and what creatures? I'm actually already kind of doing that with Operation Red Dragon and its sequel. There's as much Harryhausen in there as there is kaiju. Alarex. Alarex is a Ray Harryhausen dinosaur. You know how he's got the one dinosaur that looks it's technically an Allosaurus. Everyone calls it a T-Rex, and that's what he uses for Guanji, 1 million years BC, and so forth. That was a direct inspiration. So, kind of like that. The answer is read Operation Red Dragon. Am I aware of fan-made series on Godzilla on YouTube? Oh yeah, I'm aware of plenty of them. Analog horror ones, found footage ones. You know, the quality, of course, being fan-made, you never know what to expect. But it's always nice to see more fan-made content going out there. There's supposed to eventually be a Cloverfield 2. Any thoughts? Also, Kong has never fought aliens in a movie. True. He hasn't fought aliens. An alien foe might be interesting. Harkening back to the earlier question. As far as a Cloverfield 2 goes, I don't know. The first movie is fine as its own thing. Separate it from that crazy marketing stuff that made you think there was more to it than there actually was, and it is a very well done found footage kaiju movie. You could tell more stories from there. At this point, I think so much time has passed that people might not care anymore. Not to mention that whole Cloverfield paradox thing really kind of turned people off. Like, they were on board with the first Cloverfield. They were on board with 10 Cloverfield Lane. Cloverfield Paradox came along, and suddenly the next movie that was supposed to be in that series is no longer a Cloverfield title. It's Overlord. Sounds like Cloverfield, but not. So, I don't know. If it looks interesting, I'll give it a shot, but it just feels like too much time has passed at this point. They wanted Cloverfield to be way more of a thing than it actually wound up being. You remember Abrams' comments? He wanted Clover to be the American Godzilla because he didn't think King Kong counted because Kong was too cute. That didn't end up happening. People like Cloverfield, sure, but to say that Clover is on the same level as Godzilla, no way at all. It's because they didn't do the sequel in a timely manner. The only collectible you could get was ridiculously overpriced and only a limited edition at that. So yeah, there was no way it was actually going to happen. If you made a completely original Godzilla film with no connections to any other parts of the franchise, how would you do it? Oof. That's a very interesting question. I mean, part of me just wants to say read Operation Red Dragon because that is a Godzilla homage, but I'm not sure that's one I can just answer off the cuff, if I'm being honest. I need to really put some thought into that. Otherwise, like I said, Operation Red Dragon is sort of the closest I think I'll ever get to writing something about Godzilla. Have you ever considered showing off your physical media collection, be it your DVDs and books? Well, you can see a portion of my DVD collection behind me. I have considered showing it off, but, part of me worries about if doing that would be just putting a huge banner on here that says "Find out where I am and rob me." I don't want that to happen. But I do have a lot of them. Actually, I will say this since the topic came up, and I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but something I actually do when I'm organizing my DVDs is I put them in chronological order, as in when they would have happened in history, not when they were released. So, way back at the bottom of the very first shelf, you have your dinosaur movies, your adaptations of the Book of Genesis or early Bible texts and things, moving into ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, then into the Victorian era, and then eventually behind me you get to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then far off into the far-flung future. Why do I do it? For my own amusement. I just kind of like the idea of knowing when these movies are set, as opposed to just when they were made. So, just something weird I do. Let's see. What's your favorite animated movie? There are so many animated movies I like. I mean, obviously, even though I'm not a big fan of Disney in its current form, I grew up during the Disney Renaissance, so I'm always going to love those things like Beauty and the Beast. I was actually in a theatrical version of that at one point as the Beast. I like Aladdin and the movies from from that era, The Lion King, but also the classics. Obviously, the Secret of Kells, which was one of the first animated movies I reviewed. That is still a brilliant movie. Again, it's kind of hard to narrow down. There are a lot of really good animated projects out there, and again, I kind of wish animation got more respect here in the West. Do you think the goofification of MFE Godzilla will serve a hyper-violent animated series? On that one that focuses on pure schlock and violence? I guess we'll see what happens when that thing O'Shea Jackson is working on comes out. That G-Team animated thing that started as a MonsterVerse project, but now maybe isn't. Haven't heard much about that in a little bit, but I don't know. I don't think they would ever go too violent, though, because that's Gamera's territory. Let's. That's the animated one again. Just scrolling. The chat, the things got moved way faster than I've been answering. Would you think Godzilla being a one kaiju army outlandish? Considering that's usually what happens, it's not that outlandish. Any plans for a direct sequel to Emerald of Maddox City? Also a book where your characters cross over. There is a sequel to Emerald that I'm working on. It's kind of on the back burner at the moment, but I do have an idea of where I want it to go. Only thing I'll say at this point is it ties a little bit more into World War II. That's all I'm going to say, because that's when the books take place. And as far as the crossover question, a crossover is part of the ultimate goal, but I don't want it to happen too early. I want to finish the individual series, so write Operation Red Dragon as a series, write Occult Mafia as a series, Emerald as a series, any other things that I might have planned as a series. And then once I've told their individual stories, that's when they'll come together. I don't want to run into the issue that so many cinematic universes ended up having of either having the crossover thing be so focused on that I write something that's just set up for something else that nobody cares about and has no consequence. And I don't want to have the issue of, well, the characters have already crossed over, so now that they're apart, how come they're not interfering with what's going on in each other's series? I want to tell the completed stories first. So crossovers are part of the plan now. And an Emerald sequel will happen at some point. Like I said, I've got it started. It's just on the back burner at the moment. With your video analysis of his opponents in the 33 original, do you think the 76 remake missed the mark with not including any dinosaur such as the Tyrannosaurus for a challenge for Kong? Yeah, I think it did. Having him fight a snake is, it's not a bad thing in theory, but the original movie, like I said, it really showcased Kong as the king of Skull Island because it threw the toughest possible challenges at him, and they were challenges from a completely different time and showed that he won. Just having him fight a big snake, that's not necessarily going to get the same point across. But the 1976 King Kong is not the best iteration of that character anyway. I know it has its fans. Oh, still there. Or do you think the giant boa was enough? It wasn't enough. King Kong Escapes had Kong also fight a giant sea snake, but he fought Gorosaurus before that. So it at least went a little bit further. Well, it still wasn't quite on the level of the first movie. Yeah, I see the what was your favorite animated movie question keep popping up because it took me a little while to get to it. I have answered it, though, I promise. With the recent popularity of Godzilla these past couple of years, do you think someone will re-release the Mark Cercini novels, including finally releasing Godzilla and the Lost Continent? I imagine the rights might be a little tied up at this point. And I don't know if Toho would be stingy and say, well, if you're going to license these books, you got to license every monster that's in them as well. I don't know. But at this point, there hasn't really been any news, has there? We did get the reissue of the original Marvel comics when Godzilla was there in the 70s. So I guess never say never. As far as the Lost Continent finally getting released, that kind of depends on if it was ever completed in the first place. We know there's a little bit of it that exists because there was that tease at the end of what ultimately wound up being the last book, Godzilla versus the Robot Monsters. I don't know if Saraceni ever finished it, though. I don't seem to recall. I've read interviews with him about it, but I don't recall ever hearing if he finished the manuscript. And if he did, if he still has it. I don't know. Like I said, never say never. The Marvel Godzilla comics were reissued in a nice format, but who knows? Who knows? If you were given permission by Toho to write a Godzilla book, what would it be about? Which kaiju would you use, and how would you portray Godzilla? Again, that's kind of harkening back to that question where I said I'm not sure I can give a full answer just off the cuff. I do think I'd want to stick more to the Showa era in terms of certain things, like early Showa, because I do feel like that's the classic, right? You always go back to the classic version at some point. But yeah, it's not something I can just do off the cuff. I'm a writer. I want to put something out there that's going to be a little bit better than just, oh, I'm improvising all of this stuff on the spot. I'm sorry that's not much of an answer, but if you don't mind me asking, what was the first Godzilla movie you've seen? I've answered this a couple of times. First introduction to Godzilla was, I was very, very, very young. A little kid obsessed with dinosaurs, and my parents called me into the living room to catch the very end of Son of Godzilla. And it was unlike any other dinosaur thing I'd seen before. I'd seen the cartoon dinosaurs and stuff like Land Before Time. I think Land Before Time was a thing I'd seen before then. And, you know, I'd seen stop motion dinosaurs on TV and documentaries and stuff, drawings and everything. This was unlike anything I'd seen. And to my young eyes, I was like, wow, they're actually moving differently. They look so real. And from there, I was hooked. That's a story I've told before. But it's been a while. If Titan Tech becomes a concept in the MonsterVerse films, how would you propose getting Godzilla to allow humans to equip him with the technology? Probably have to do it while he's asleep. I can just imagine them sneaking in and like having all of these things surrounding the Coliseum as Godzilla's taking his cat nap. And then as soon as he stirs, they like give the signal, okay, now. And as he's getting up and still groggy, all these things are attaching to him. He finally comes to consciousness and he's like, what the? Well, okay, whatever. Got a monster to kill. Hope this stuff doesn't get in the way. You know, see, when I do stuff off the cuff, that's what comes to mind, and it's ridiculous. Do you think there's been a turnaround with a better recipient towards kaiju media with critical positivity towards -1? Maybe, but, you know, Godzilla -1 could very well be viewed the same way as the original King Kong, where it's the exception as opposed to the rule. So I think we have yet to see the full effects that Godzilla versus Kong will have. No, not Godzilla versus Kong. I don't think we've seen the full effect of Godzilla -1 just yet. Obviously, there were plenty of people who liked it. Even people who aren't normally into Godzilla thought it was a great movie. Of course, some of those people suddenly declared themselves to be experts and made a bunch of videos where they just got everything wrong in their assessments. But you got to put aside the stuff like the tourists and the political grifters and everyone. And it's only been like a year, less than 2 years at this point. We don't have the full idea of what impact -1 was going to have. We only learned what sort of impact Shin Godzilla was going to have when we got the Polygon trilogy and Singular Point, right? Where we saw, Toho's trying to make it happen again and it's not working. So I think we need to see what comes next. And I'm not talking about the new Empire. That was already in the works anyway. And the Monsterverse is kind of its own thing. Although, again, -1 might be having an impact on GXK3, or would it be GXK2? Well, the next Monsterverse movie. Time will tell, I think. But overall, I think we still have a little ways to go. Just scrolling for another... Oh, we're past 2 hours. I'm not sure I'm going to keep this going for too much longer. How would you handle Rodan if you were a writer for the Monsterverse? I have an idea for a Rodan redemption arc. Like, because he was Ghidorah's lackey in King of the Monsters, and he's still alive, but we haven't seen him since. And as far as we know, he's still considered one of the quote-unquote bad guys. But I have this idea of how you could actually have him turn into one of the good guys. And if Legendary wants to know it, they gotta pay me. I don't want to give him any ideas for free. I'm a struggling artist. Gotta make a living. Thoughts on the Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack? Wasn't really fond of it. Trying too hard to be disturbing, if you ask me. Do you think the reptiles in the Monsterverse heads and teeth are too small? I think G14 had the best head and body design. The Skullcrawler's second to best, and Shimo third, but her teeth were too small. Well, the teeth don't necessarily bother me. Like I said earlier, I think Godzilla's head has gotten a little too small, and I would like to see it enlarged a little. Although, similar issue with -1, right? -1 Godzilla's head is really tiny. Any smaller and he'd look like Red King from Ultraman. So, both Japan and America, Godzilla's allowed to have a slightly bigger head. You don't have to go too big. How do you introduce alien races in the Monsterverse? Other than King Ghidorah? Well, you could always go the Ancient Aliens route. And I remember Michael Dougherty said that some of the figures in the lost city that they found Godzilla in were supposed to be Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki, of course, there's that whole Zechariah Sitchin thing, the 12th planet, and all those books. So there's a hint of it that they just haven't really expanded on yet. You could go that route and say that ancient aliens were somehow involved in it. Whether or not they're still around would be another question. But that would be one way to introduce them. Assuming, of course, that you think they haven't already been introduced. Excuse me. I know you're a big Farscape fan. Will you ever do any kind of review of it? I've wanted to. There are actually quite a few series I've wanted to review. The only thing preventing me is that reviewing series takes a long time as opposed to reviewing a movie. I can write a script easily enough, but for a series, especially a long-running series, that's a lot of stuff you gotta sift through when you're actually putting the video together. And, with Farscape, that's 4 seasons, 4 full, 20-plus episode seasons of hour-long episodes, and a movie at the end. So, that's a little intimidating. Even just a single season 26 anime episode is intimidating at this point. So I would like to talk about Farscape. I really would. I'm sure there's a way. One way I've considered is actually not doing a full review, but just doing a focus on Scorpius, because I think he's such a fascinating villain. and you could get a lot of material just from analyzing how he works, and even show that like he's the sort of sympathetic villain that we need right now, as opposed to what is passing for sympathetic villains these days. But again, that still requires me to sift through a lot of different episodes, right? So it's just intimidation factor on my part. I do want to one day, though. What are some of your favorite graphic novels you've read? Well, everybody says that Watchmen is the best graphic novel ever. It's fine. But among my favorite graphic novels, I would say I really liked what Darwin Cook did with anything, really. Like DC The New Frontier, that's a pretty brilliant series that's got the retro style, but also serves as sort of a way to bridge the Golden Age and the Silver Age. I also like what he did with Spirit, as far as I've read in that regard. When IDW's Godzilla series is good, it's really good. Stuff like Godzilla Cataclysm, Godzilla vs. Power Rangers, things like that. My graphic novel collection is in sight, but again, if I'd known. I also kind of like when there are crossovers, as long as they're done well. Masks was pretty interesting from Dynamite Entertainment, where it's the crossover with the Shadow, the Green Hornet, the Spider, Miss Fury, all those early either pulp heroes or forgotten early comic book heroes. Although it could have been a little better. They could have made better use of the Spider because it was his story and they just sort of threw everyone else into it. That would be it was originally called the Black Police trilogy, but now it's called the Spider versus the Empire State when it's reprinted. That's another thing I need to review, actually. So much to review. Do you enjoy Studio Ghibli, and what's your favorite movie from them? I've seen some Studio Ghibli. Porco Rosso was pretty good. Yeah, I'll stick with that. I like Porco Rosso. That one doesn't get enough attention. Have you ever read the Dragon Riders of Perm books? If not, I highly recommend them. Haven't read them yet, but I am aware of them. I read a book once. I don't quite remember the title, but it felt kind of like it was... If it wasn't part of that series, then it was definitely inspired by it. But I don't think it was actually part of it. Thoughts on Don Bluth in his movies? Well, Don Bluth, obviously, he's done some really good stuff. Yeah, I've seen both of the American Tail movies, original Land Before Time. Surprisingly, The Secret of Nim has evaded me up to this point, although I'm told that's one of his best, even though it tanked when it was first released. Of course, further along he went, the more divisive his work got. Titan AE I thought was interesting, though not necessarily... It was okay, but his early stuff is really something else. Thoughts on Sonic 3 and the new Mario movie? Also, are you ever going to make a video reviews of them? Well, I mentioned earlier I haven't seen Sonic 3 just yet. I didn't see the Mario movie either. Just being that I'm not that much of a gamer, I wasn't really that interested. But I don't know, maybe one day. Do you think Godzilla's been handled well in animation recently in mainstream media? Given that the most recent handling of him in animation has been Singular Point and the Polygon trilogy, no. I do not think he's been handled well there. It's weird that the best Godzilla animation that exists currently not only comes from America, but it's based on the 1998 movie. Talk about living in bizarro world. But I do think Godzilla can work in animation. That's the thing. Yeah, there's a lot of potential there for kaiju animation. It's just, for some reason, Godzilla hasn't clicked with it yet. Gamera worked, even if the animation style, the art style was kind of ugly. Gridman worked. There's that Ultraman anime from the 70s that worked. I don't know why Godzilla is so hard to figure out when it comes to animation, though. Did I ever read the Quintalio Ascension trilogy? Oh, I know about it. Those are the spacefaring dinosaurs. I want to read those. I am very intrigued to read those, but I haven't just yet. What do you think of the kaiju Pokemon Tyranitar? Nidoking. Oh, these are all. I've never actually got into Pokemon all that much. I did notice that Aerodactyl bore a striking resemblance to Rodan, of course. But, you know, I'm not really that into Pokemon. Just, even though I'm from the first generation that was introduced to it. But, I don't have any thoughts on them, I guess. Where do we put the questions? Do we just put them in the chat? Yes. Just put them in the chat. Oh, sure I can. Hi, Jordan. Glad you're a fan. Hope you enjoy what comes next. What else we got here? I do have a silly question. What would your take be on a MonsterVerse prequel film set in ancient Hollow if Legendary does decide on it? Well, that gives me a little bit more focus than the other what would I do questions. I think that, well, again, mentioning the whole they were supposed to be Anunnaki on the wall paintings thing, that would certainly be one element to put in. Sort of maybe draw a little bit from those writings, your Eric von Daniken's, your Zachariah Sitchin's, but not 100%. So sort of maybe not tie them in, don't adapt it exactly, but have that be an element. So you maintain this whole ancient mythology, but not quite what you expect sort of thing that the MonsterVerse established. And maybe don't show too much, though. You want to show that the Anunnaki maybe are manipulating things, but you don't want to give away how they've done everything. Maintain an air of not mysticism, but mystery. That's the word. Maintain an air of mystery to it. Maybe play it a little ambiguous still, so you don't quite know if what you're looking at is supernatural or scientific. That would be one thing to consider. And of course, you got to make the story really, really good, because being a prequel, there's already sort of a preconceived idea that things are going to be fine by the end. But, yep. So you really want to get the audience invested in a way that they forget about that, which can be done. It's just takes a certain finesse. I tried watching Farscape since I like some of Jim Henson's productions, but that aren't just the Muppets. I couldn't get into it personally. Oh well, that's too bad. The first couple episodes are a little rough, but once it picks up, man, it really goes well. How do you feel about the Attack on Titan films? The live action ones, you mean? Well, the Titans were more interesting in that than they are in the actual anime, at least as far as I saw in the anime. But otherwise, those are some of the ugliest and most lackluster movies I've ever come across, at least out of Japan anyway. Wasn't too fond of them. Let's see. Really enjoyed reading your writing so far and have recently begun my own kaiju-related fiction. Do you have any advice as an author on not biting off more than you can chew at the start? Not biting off more than you can chew at the start. Interesting question. Well, there's all kinds of different bits of advice that people can give you, but I guess I can give you a little bit of a personal example since I'm currently working on the sequel to Operation Red Dragon. Part of what was holding me up at first was a feeling that I was doing too much setup, and I was nowhere close to actually beginning the story. So I was kind of biting off more than I could chew right there. But what I basically had to do was I had to set it aside for a little bit, and I read back over it. Once I figured out a way to actually get the ball rolling, I read back over what I had, figured out what I could keep, what I had to move to later, and what I had to just forget entirely. And what ultimately made it all come together was I needed to have something that actually created a sense of urgency. Because when you have an impending event that the characters have to deal with, they don't have time for small talk and pleasantries and everything. They've got to actually handle what's going on. If you've ever seen a movie where they're always talking about this thing that's going to happen, but they don't know when, or like the goalpost keeps getting moved or something, that often leads to those kind of problems. So, you know, there's also the old bit of advice with the acronym KISS: keep it simple, stupid. Right? Not that I'm calling anyone here stupid, but you don't. There is something good about simplicity in its own way. You know, there are so many different stories where you can actually just boil it down to this guy wants to do this thing, or boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl, right? Or something like that. You don't want to, if you don't want to bite off more than you can chew, then decide what the primary thing is supposed to be. What is the one thing that all of the characters are going to be drawn together to focus on? Or if it's not every single character, what is the main character going to be focused on? And how much time does he have to do it? And what does he need to do in order to achieve whatever his goal is? Just maintain a little bit of simplicity. If you want to not bite off more than you can chew at the beginning, don't necessarily keep it simple. You can, but if it will benefit from adding a little more to it, then do so. But if you're just starting off, you know, as Stephen King said in his book on writing, only God gets it right on the first draft. The rest of us, we have to do it multiple times in order to get it right. So I hope that makes sense. I really do. Again, when I'm just coming off the cuff like this, sometimes I just pray that what I'm saying makes sense. What are your thoughts on Ralph Bakshi's work? Well, I haven't seen that much of it. I have seen Wizards. Wizards is an experience. The other stuff doesn't seem like it would really be up my alley per se. But, you know, he did some pretty interesting stuff no matter how you look at it. So, will you do some figure review? Well, I have. Is there something more specific? Maybe, but I do figure reviews when I can. I've done the Titanic Creations one recently. Maybe a bioluminescent mushroom rainforest in the Hollow Earth. Kind of Vernian in that. He had the mushroom forest, didn't he? The giant mushrooms. Pretty sure that was Verne. Jules Verne, that is. Without giving too much away, can you give any hints for topics you plan on reviewing or covering in the coming months? I have mentioned I want to finally get around to Gappa, as well as a couple other kaiju movies, and I got my Patreon requests for things like Nope and a couple others. One video, I'm going to do a Looney Tunes related thing towards the end of February to try and time that with the day the Earth blew up, and a couple other animated related things. I've also got plans to do two things related to Scrooge McDuck, if you can believe it. Specifically, the comic book The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck and the concept album that was inspired by it. That's something I finally want to get to talking about. And there are two different things I'm going to do on that. One of them is like an actual proper review of both the comic and the album, and the other is how they got away with it without Disney's involvement. And beyond that, there are all kinds of other things I could do. There are more Kaiju Lit circles that'll be coming up, and maybe I'll try doing a couple more anime related reviews. I've got some shows in mind that I want to discuss that don't tend to get discussed as much these days. Let's see. Is Disney too far gone to save? I don't think so. I mean, if it stays on its current path and just keeps doing the live action remakes and Marvel movies that make no sense and everything, then yeah, it won't be much longer for this world. But then again, I also just watched the documentary Waking Sleeping Beauty, and I know that they've been in dire straits before, and they've come out of it. They just needed to have somebody come along and actually know how to steer the ship. And, that wasn't always easy, but they found a way, and that's how the Disney Renaissance happened, which led to the general animation renaissance of the 80s and 90s. So I don't think Disney's beyond saving, but it needs to actually start making those steps. Did I miss any? Are there any monsters not from Toho you would like to see in the Monsterverse? Would you like to see them in certain roles or just exist in the world? Well, yeah. Obviously, Gamera comes to mind. I've mentioned him a couple times. I actually think they could technically introduce Reptosaurus. Reptosaurus is a public domain monster, so they could bring him in. If you don't know, Reptosaurus was originally Reptilicus in Charlton Comics, but they only did a couple issues with that before losing the rights. So they said, instead of Reptilicus, he's Reptosaurus now. And then the rights just kind of expired after Charlton went under, and now he's public domain, so they could use him. Anyone can use him. Also, I've made a case for the Loch Ness Monster being introduced as a kaiju, so there are plenty of things. As far as having them be active or play certain roles, obviously I'd like to see them be more active. If you're going to bring them in, have them do something. Sometimes it's nice just to know they exist. Do you keep up with analog horror at all, aside from Godzilla related stuff? There's some analog horror I keep up with, but it's sometimes they tend to blend together, because you have one that takes off and then everybody wants to imitate that. And then another one takes off that's different and everyone wants to imitate that. So analog horror, I think, is kind of still figuring out how to get past that imitation phase and find more unique things to do. But I've seen a couple, like the Gemini one is an interesting one that I found. So we'll see where that goes, but updates are slow on that one. Are you interested in any kind of world history, and is there a certain time period and location you'd like to see a kaiju film in? Well, I really do like history. And as far as what a monster would appear in, I mean, anything could work, really. I mean, there's so much you could do. As far as ones I'm particularly fond of, like, I kind of like the Victorian era with specifically the aesthetic, because things were a lot fancier back then. But I also like the 30s with the Art Deco aesthetic and the best style of hat. There's plenty of things. I would say I'd land somewhere in like the 30s and 40s, even though there was a war happening in the 40s. What did you think of the Keanu Reeves Dracula movie? So must mean the Francis Ford Coppola one, because that's the only Dracula movie I can think of that Keanu Reeves was in. It's interesting. Uh, definitely, I can definitely respect how they did so much in the way of practical effects there and in camera work and everything. Um, that being said, I haven't seen it in a while. Bunny Monsters. Oh, I answered a variation of that. Same guy. Let's see. We're past 2.5 hours. I think I'm gonna start winding down here, but I will try to get to a couple more questions. What novel or novel series would potentially make great movies in the future? Hmm. I've always I mean there was a time I wanted to see Dinotopia animated, not animated, adapted, but then I saw what happened when it did get adapted. Now I'm not so sure. It's got to be given to somebody that actually knows what they're doing. Uh, any other thing that might. There's actually a book that I've recently found, and I'm very close to finishing it, so I might do a review on this as well. It's a largely forgotten sort of pulp adventure called A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. It's kind of a Lost World, Antarctic exploration story. It's very unusual. And I think it would make an interesting sort of adventure story or mini series, even if it was done well. And that's always the trick, right? It's got to be done well. How do you think that unmade Tim Burton's Godzilla would have been like? And how much would it have changed the franchise? The 1994 one? I don't know. It uh, and probably would have started the kaiju craze a lot sooner. Might have had the advantage of riding on the dinosaur craze of the 90s, but also being something a little bit different. Of course, Jurassic Park basically killed any dinosaur project that wasn't Jurassic Park. So, I don't know. Would you prefer a story with a lot of interesting layers and themes but boring characters, or a story with a simple, almost paper thin plot but great characters? Well, my opinion is this. Characters are why you care about a story. If you don't care about the characters, you're not going to get invested no matter how thematically rich the story actually is, because you're not going to have anything to connect to on a personal level. Think about it. It's not just a question of. Let me start that sentence over and be a little more specific. What do people always talk about? When they're talking about fiction, are they just talking about, is it okay for one character to kill another character, or are they talking about, is it okay for Batman to kill the Joker? Why do they always discuss that? Because they care about Batman and the Joker. They're invested in those characters, and that's because they're invested in them, because Batman and the Joker are very well written. If they were not well written, not only would they not have lasted as long as they have, but people wouldn't even be having that discussion, because just the general question is something that they might not even want to address. But when they're talking about characters they actually care about, that's when it matters to them. And there are plenty of stories out there that have great characters. They don't necessarily have the best plots. I think that's a large part of why a lot of people, myself included, were forgiving towards Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. The plot is bizarrely nonsensical and contrived at times, but we're so invested in what happens with Kong and Godzilla. That's what we care about. So I'd rather have the strong characters. Ideally, I would have good characters and a good plot. But if it's a case of only good plot or only good characters, give me only good characters. I mean, heck, there's that one thing. What is it? My Dinner with Andre, where it's just the two guys sitting on a table. Nothing happens except them talking. If that's not an example of how much good characterization matters, then I don't know what is. Favorite novel and favorite movie based on a novel. I mean, I kind of answered this one. I mean, there are so many. Like, it's hard to narrow down. Like, I like the original Frankenstein. I like Jurassic Park. I like so many of them. I don't know if I could narrow it down. What do you think of cute monsters or ones that just look like normal animals? I've also done that in a few things I've done. Like, those kind of monsters feel more real effective sometimes. Hmm, it's entirely circumstantial, right? It depends on the context. If you're presenting a cute monster in something that's meant to be full on horror, it's not going to get the same effect. The But if you're introducing a cute monster in something where the monsters are not supposed to be that menacing, it works a little better. Like, you compare the monster designs in Ultraman Cosmos, which is supposed to be more child friendly, to the monsters in Ultraman Nexus, which is an adult series, not like not, not like TVMA adult, but definitely aimed more at adults. The contrast is night and day. The monsters in Cosmos are cute because we're supposed to be a bit more sympathetic to them. Monsters in Nexus are grotesque because they're horrifying and we don't want to connect with them. I'm only going to do a couple more of these, I think. So if I didn't get to yours, don't take it personally. I'm sorry. It's just I've been doing this for a while and I'd like to start winding down before I completely wear out my voice. Let's see. I don't think I've answered anything from this fellow yet. This has probably been talked about to death, but what are your thoughts on Evangelion and the impact it's still having? Actually, that hasn't come up in any of these Q&As yet, I don't think. Evangelion is a series that I liked on the first viewing. Then I kept watching it and the cracks started to show. And then I watched other anime that came afterward that did what the stuff it was doing, but a little bit better because they actually planned it in advance. And it's not that I don't like Neon Genesis Evangelion, but I don't prefer it compared to other series. But I also can't deny the impact, right? The third impact, if you will. It definitely deserves its place in history, although I do sometimes wonder if it's a little bit overhyped, because I remember people saying, oh, before Neon Genesis Evangelion, anime and manga didn't have complex characters. What? No, there are plenty of series from before then that had complex characters. You're just ignoring them because it was pre-Evangelion. But and even that same year that Evangelion came along, yes, it was a big deal, but you also had Slayers, you had Ghost in the Shell, you had a bunch of other shows that helped bring things forward. Evangelion just took off above all the others because it went in a more artistic direction and got a bit stranger, and that made it more memorable. But ultimately, I'm not the biggest fan of it. Which is not to say I hate it. I just am not as enamored with it. But I do respect its place in history. Let's find another. What's your advice to anyone who wants to break out of laziness and try to do something creative potential? Well, breaking out of laziness is difficult. I'm not gonna say that you just gotta button up your pants and do it, because then it just becomes, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. But really, the way you break out of the laziness is to actually start a routine, and that's going to take effort at first, but it really is the only way to do it. You can't keep putting it off. You can't keep thinking I'll get to it tomorrow, because eventually you'll run out of tomorrows and realize you have never got around to it. So one bit of advice I got when I first started on this journey of not just writing but also YouTubing and everything was even though it's not your job yet, treat it like it is. And if you treat it like your job, that means you're going to commit to it. So that's one way to motivate yourself. Think of it like think of it like you're almost sort of bringing it into existence. There's this interesting I saw the beginning of a documentary about David Bowie at one point, about specifically, like, they were talking about Ziggy Stardust and the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, which is the album that really brought him into his career as a big rock star. And they said he basically wrote an album, because it's a concept album, where he was already a big rock star, released it, and it came true. So he treated that like it was already a thing. He just had to let everybody else know it was that it was the case. So that would be my advice. You got to set up a routine, and you can't just treat it like it's a hobby. If you're really serious about it, then be serious about it. It's like I said in one of my videos earlier this week about the whole Thermion argument thing. You got to take it seriously. And once you start taking it seriously, and once you develop the routine, it will get easier. At least easier in terms of getting off your butt, basically, and doing it. It may not necessarily be easy in terms of coming up with the story and getting words onto the page or art onto the paper or something like that, but you will actually still have a routine. And if you're having trouble figuring out what to write in terms of a story, then try writing something else. Just make a list of something, as long as it keeps you writing. It might not actually amount to anything, but it will help you stay in that routine. And that's as good as I can come up with for this. I mean, worst comes to worse, you might have to invest in a cattle prod to shock yourself when you start feeling lazy about it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Let's see. I'll do a couple more of these. Have I seen the Hellboy the Crooked Man yet? I heard it was garbage and honestly forgot it even existed. Nope, haven't seen it. Didn't bother with it. Didn't look good. I still wish that someone had been able to make the third Del Toro one work out. You know, at least we would have had some closure there. Do you have any way to get yourself motivated to write? I have a lot of ideas, but there's all sorts of other things I end up doing. Well, that kind of ties into the last question. You got to actually commit to it. And another thing you might have to do is figure out what actually helps you get in the mindset. There's always, this is not something that writers often impart or that you're necessarily going to learn in school or something. But sometimes writers need very specific circumstances in order to do the job. For me, for example, I have a hard time writing if I'm not listening to music. So I actually still have an iPod right back there in that station. And it has, I change up the playlist every once in a while, but basically I will start playing playing all the songs that I have downloaded alphabetically, starting at whatever the first A song is, going all the way through to Z. And if there's anything that's in a different language or with numbers or something that comes after it, go through all of them. And when I'm done, I update the playlist and I start it all over again. And that, for some reason, helps me focus. I can't explain it. It's just what I need in order to really concentrate. But it might be different for you. Maybe you need absolute silence. Maybe you need to be in a very specific room, or maybe you don't need to be in a room at all. Maybe you need to be outdoors, or maybe you have to jog first. I don't know. That's something you got to figure out for yourself, because it's always going to be different for different people. But figuring out how you'll be able to focus is another big part of it. And once you figure that out and you can make that part of your routine, again, it won't necessarily be 100% easy, but you will be able to commit to it a bit easier. What else we got here? What movie do you think would have worked being animated by Disney during the 90s or 2000s? Like Phantom of the Opera, King Kong, Alice Through the Looking Glass, etc. Etc. Why did I say etc.? It's etc. Interesting question, though, because Disney did some interesting stuff in the 90s. What could they have done? The Phantom of the Opera was an interesting suggestion. Because there's so many versions of that, and they could have gotten the rights to the Andrew Lloyd Webber one, or they could have done something on their own. Although the Phantom that's one they probably would have made a few changes to, kind of like what they did with Hunchback of Notre Dame. Something else they could have done, though. What might have been an interesting story for them to adapt? I'm trying to think of some other stories they could have. Well, they kind of dipped their toes into Greek mythology with Hercules, so they could have done any other Greek thing, really. Could have spun off of that, maybe done a prequel hinting about like Phil and Achilles or something. They also potentially, I mean, they could have done some towards the end there. They were doing like sort of niche sci-fi stuff, like they did the steampunk stuff with Atlantis: The Lost Empire. They did a sci-fi version of Treasure Island called Treasure Planet. So they maybe could have done a weird spin on something like that, perhaps. Maybe, I don't know, a fantasy spin on what would have been. Actually, for some reason, it just dawned on me. They could have maybe done something interesting with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Imagine if they'd gotten Robin Williams for that one. I'll do a couple more, but I am going to wrap this up pretty soon. What would you do with a Popeye Lovecraft crossover? Oh, I did mention that in my one public domain thing, where I was saying you don't necessarily have to avoid horror when you're using public domain characters, but there's more than slasher horror. And I suggested Popeye versus Cthulhu. I think you could do something interesting there with like having Popeye be the one being in the world who's strong enough to actually punch a deep one and have him stay down or something. And you can explore that interesting idea of what motivates him to fight against these eldritch horrors, and is it actually a fight he could ever win? And of course, if you're not sure about the spinach being public domain or not, have it actually be green slime that he consumes to make him stronger. That comes from these things. Like he's absorbing their strength. Again, don't take it personally if I miss one of your questions. I know you're at least somewhat familiar with pulp heroes, so do you have any reading recommendations for someone who wants to start reading The Shadow? Well, I guess just start reading The Shadow. If you can find the pulp novels, I'm not sure how easy they are to find these days. I remember there was a time they were being reprinted in bookstores along with the Doc Savage ones. I should have picked up more than I actually wound up doing, but I don't know where they are now. But there's also a few Dynamite comics. The Shadow Year One is an interesting place to start because it would give the origin, although it does make a little more sense if you're a bit more familiar with other things in the Shadow's story. He also has a crossover with the Green Hornet, the Shadow, the Green Hornet, Dark Knights through Dynamite. Obviously, listen to the radio shows if you can find them. And there's also, of course, the sort of imitators of the Shadow. If you want to read the Spider's the best of the Shadow's imitators. And you get that same sort of thing of the gun-toting, steel-jawed hero fighting against evil, but way more fantastical. So Yeah, I think that's what I would say. The pulps are kind of designed where you can start anywhere and kind of similar with a radio show, but there are some things you got to wait on. And I think I'll do one more. Let's see. Would you say Monster vs. Godzilla as a character becomes inconsistent with his portrayal in GVK and GXK compared to earlier entries? I've seen people say Goji is too aggressive now. Has he changed? I've heard those arguments too. The way I see it, you can't really fault Godzilla for getting a little more aggressive when people are shooting at him. But, he also has the ancient rivalry with Kong, so obviously there's going to be a thing there. But I think part of the reason why he's more aggressive in these other movies is because we're seeing it more from Kong's perspective than Godzilla's perspective. Not that we've gotten a movie 100% from his perspective in the Monsterverse yet, but because we're more focused on Kong than Godzilla, obviously to Kong, Godzilla's going to be more menacing. But at the same time, we got the first season of Monarch Legacy of Monsters, which I was hoping would turn out better than it actually did, but it did get the whole idea with Godzilla. For as uneven and weird and contradictory as that show could be, there was still that one moment where they say, well, like after Godzilla wakes up and Kurt Russell's character says, "You looked into his eyes, he knows what he's doing." So, I do still think there's that. I don't think Godzilla's strayed so far that he's going to that he's inconsistent. Because again, like he's still protecting cities. He's sleeping in Rome, but he's not destroying it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's that bad. I'll do one more, folks. How about that? One more. Is there one more? I actually did catch up. So, we are nearly at 3 hours. I did go a little bit longer than I thought I would, but you guys had some good questions this go around, just like last time. Okay. Well, I will call that it for tonight then. Thank you all for joining me, and I will be doing another one of these at some point, but I also want to get a couple other guests or have some returning guests in future live streams. So for now, I just want to once again thank you all for joining me. Again, do all the usual YouTube stuff or consider becoming a patron or something. And again, just thank you all for showing up and giving me some interesting things to ponder tonight. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.